British Prime Minister Theresa May expected to soon address the UK Parliament. This as she warns that holding another referendum on leaving the EU would break faith with the British people. Also, French Prime Minister Edouard Philippe concedes the government made mistakes while also hoping the sharp drop in yellow vest protesters is signalling an end to the biggest crisis of the Macron presidency. And Paris Saint-Germain set to face off Manchester United in the Champions League round of 16. We'll have more on the group stages that are seeded for the last 32 draw. Hello and welcome back to the France 24 newsroom. I'm Annette Young. And we begin in London, where British Prime Minister Theresa May is expected to speak to Parliament in the next few hours. The British leader has already warned that holding yet another referendum on the EU would break faith with the British people. Former Prime Ministers John Major and Tony Blair are among those urging a new referendum if MPs cannot agree on a way forward. However, May is expected to argue that to hold another referendum would cause irreparable damage to the integrity of UK politics. Last week, she called off a Commons vote on her Brexit deal, admitting it would have been likely rejected. Earlier, I spoke to our international affairs editor, Armand Georgian.
Tony Blair saying that since the political establishment can't agree, the only way is to go to the British people again. Now, Theresa May's supporters say several problems with that. Firstly, there wouldn't be any agreement on what the question would be in a second referendum, in a ballot. They do have a point because Jeremy Corbyn, the leader of the opposition, he himself says he doesn't know what the question would be if this happened tomorrow. Secondly, there might not be any clear majority for any particular course of action coming out of a second referendum. And thirdly, even if there is, there would probably be calls for a third referendum, because if Remain won, then Leave would feel cheated and, of course, immediately start campaigning for yet another referendum or an annulment of the second referendum. So this risk of some quite nasty divisions is something Theresa May will almost certainly refer to in her statement this afternoon.
So what are polls revealing about British public opinion, especially as the political chaos continues?
Well, the polls, one has to say, are sort of going in the direction of Tony Blair and John Major, in a sense. I mean, if you look at YouGov polling, you see a very clear trend, a steady decline, an almost straight line in decline in support for Brexit since 2016. And there's a particularly oft-quoted poll from the beginning of last year, which was unusually large. It sampled 20,000 people. And that was carried out by Survation, so that's from November of this year. That shows there'd be an 8-point margin in a second vote, so a very clear victory for Remain if that were to happen now. What we've also seen in polls, Annette, is that the economic arguments have really come to the fore. All these warnings, dire forecasts we've had from business community, that really seems to have had an impact on polls. People are very worried about that, giving the lie to the Brexiteers' argument that the vote was not really about the economy, it was about taking back political control from Brussels. That hasn't really been borne out in more recent polls.
And dare I ask, Armin, what is the next stage? Because literally it's impossible to predict at the moment, isn't it?
It's impossible to predict, but the latest idea that is sort of doing the rounds now is for Parliament to hold a series of what are called indicative votes. That's to say, non-binding votes to try to find an alternative to Theresa May's deal, which Parliament, as everybody knows, is going to reject. Now, what is that alternative? Is it a Norway-style solution, a Canada-style solution? The problem with all that is this kind of consultation in Parliament, it should have happened 30 months ago before she went off to Brussels to start the negotiations. It's not something that should be happening at the end of this whole process, at the end of 30 months of negotiations. So to me, it sounds like another clutching at straws and also more recipe for confusion and chaos. But of course, Annette, MPs will naturally try anything that gets them off the hook in a way, at least so that they can say, well, look, we tried to do something, we tried to stop a no-deal Brexit, because after all, they did vote for that. They did vote to say we're going to leave. They rubber-stamped this whole approach. And if there is a no-deal Brexit on March the 29th, MPs will have to share the blame with the British government.
Armand Georgian, international affairs editor there. And here in France, the Prime Minister Edouard Philippe has conceded that the government had made mistakes. This as he outlined details of new measures announced in response to the Yellow Vest protest movement. He says the government had not listened enough to the concerns of the French public, yet he hopes the sharp drop in protesters over the weekend signals an end to the crisis. His comments come as there's increasing demand for the right to a citizens' referendum from members of the fractured movement.
The Citizens' Initiative referendum, now one of the main demands of Yellow Vest protesters in France. The RIC would in theory allow the people to propose a law, get rid of one, change the constitution, or demand the resignation of an elected official. The idea is that once 700,000 people ask for it, there would have to be a national referendum on the issue.
It will allow all citizens to express themselves and maybe change things they don't want.
Whereas before, only the president could call a referendum, since 2008, one can be triggered if 185 members of parliament and 10% of voters want it. But this has never been done.
It's very complicated. 185 MPs and 4.5 million voters, and no member of parliament has taken the initiative. Perhaps because they don't trust it.
Speaking to Congress last year, Emmanuel Macron said he wanted to reconsider voting rights to better integrate the opinions of French people. But as yet, no action has been taken. The government is, however, keen to show they're open to discussion with the Yellow Vests. They're organising so-called citizens' consultations, discussions that will take place across the country between government representatives, Yellow Vests and members of political parties and unions. Set to last until March, one of the themes of these debates will be democracy.
And some football news now. And the draw for the round of 16th of Champions League took place earlier today in Lyon, Switzerland. The two French teams still in the running for the title, Paris Saint-Germain and Lyon, were paired up with Manchester United and Barcelona respectively. However, the big shock of the day was Italy's Juventus, who will be playing Atletico Madrid. The first match of the round of 16 will take place on the 12th of February. Now let's get more from Simon Harding from our sports desk. So, the big thing there, of course, Paris Saint-Germain been paired up with Manchester United. That's going to be a match to be watched, isn't it?
Absolutely, no, especially for all the French fans around. And it's one that, of course, was kind of expected for Paris because they were going to have to draw against a good team regardless of the results, because, of course, in the group stages, there were so many strong teams that finished second. The question really for Paris now, and it's the first meeting between these two clubs, it's kind of a struggle between an up-and-coming club, a French club, which has got a very relatively new history, which is starting to establish itself in Europe against, of course, one of the powerhouses of European football, Manchester United. Paris, who their objective is, of course, to reach the semi-finals for the first time in the competition. Can they do that against a Manchester United team who are really struggling? Plenty of question marks surrounding the manager, Jose Mourinho, and their star player, Paul Pogba. The way United's season is going so far, Paris are the clear favourites, and depending on whether or not Manchester United allow them to get some changes into the club, then it should be Paris to win. So it's all a question of time in that tie.
And I do know that Manchester United fans take great joy in dissing Paris Saint-Germain as the newcomers on the scene, that's for sure. So what are the other news emerged from today's draw?
Well, as you were saying when you were talking before, Annette, of course, Juventus Atletico Madrid is also a huge fixture, mainly because it's two incredibly defensive blocks. Atletico Madrid and Juventus got a proud history of having very good defences, so it'll be interesting to see how those neutralise each other. Then, of course, we've got Liverpool against Bayern Munich, last year's finalists. Liverpool play against the best team in German history in Bayern Munich. That one's going to be one to watch as well. Manchester City, who are, of course, the star team in England at the moment, they've got a relatively easy round against Schalke, but, of course, on paper, it's always easy to say that once you get onto the pitch, it's much more difficult. Lyon against Barcelona, well, that's really going to be an uphill battle for the French team. Barcelona out and out favourites there. And, of course, Real Madrid, who take on the new boys, Ajax, the Dutch team, really rejuvenated. Their star player, Frankie de Jong's got a bright future, and of course Madrid's struggling since Cristiano Ronaldo left.
Simon, thank you so much for that. And that's it for this edition. Do stay with us here on France 24.